In the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Israelites and Arameans are often seen as being closely related. This is clearly seen in the patriarchal narratives about Abraham's family coming from Aram Naharaim and Isaac and Jacob's marrying Aramean wives, and of course in the Creed in Deuteronomy 26:5, in which the Israelite speaks of his ancestor as being a wandering Aramean, Arami Oved Avi. In other words, according to the Pentateuchal tradition, the ancestors of Israel and the ancestors of the Arameans were closely related and kept up their kinship ties through several generations. In this presentation, I would like to go to the other end of the Tanakh, to examine the way in which Arameans are portrayed in the book of Chronicles. The book of Chronicles is a Second Temple or post-exilic historiography that uses, adapts, and changes earlier biblical texts in order to make them relevant to its contemporary audience. In the following moments, I intend to examine various appearances of Aram and Arameans in the book of Chronicles in an attempt to understand what meaning this ethnonym had to the chronicler and his audience. Were the Arameans simply a kingdom from the pre-exilic past or an ancient enemy of Israel? Were they a people to whom Israel were related, as they appear to be in the Torah and in other biblical passages? Were they a people who still had relevance to the chronicler's audience? The answers to these questions are significant in our understanding the chronicler's historiographical methods, as well as in better understanding the ongoing relationship between Jews and Arameans into the Second Temple period. So let's start at the beginning. The very first reference to Aram in the entire Bible is in Genesis 10:22, the so-called Table of Nations, in which the priestly author lays out his conception of all of humanity as one big family descended from Noah and his 3 sons. The sons of Shem are Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The chronicler, who was an obvious fan of the genealogical genre, copied this reference together with most of the chapter, thus recognizing Aram as one of the major branches of the Semitic peoples, of which the ancestors of Israel are another. The next group of references to Aram in Genesis are those connected with the tradition of the patriarch's origin from Haran, Aram Naharaim, and Padan Aram. Bethuel, father of Rebekah, and Levin the Aramean, all descended from Nahor, brother of Abraham. None of this is even hinted at in Chronicles. Haran, Padan Aram, Bethuel, and Levin are not even mentioned in Chronicles. In my opinion, the chronicler simply did not consider them to be relevant. Unlike Israel's relationship to Edom and Ishmael, which the chronicler did mention, their relationship to Aram was not relevant to the chronicler's audience, the people of Persian period Judea. These people had both Edomites and Ishmaelites, or Arabs, on their southern frontier. But by the Persian period, no actual people called Arameans existed in the worldview of contemporary Judeans, and as such their relationship with Israel was a non-issue. Arameans do appear twice in the chronicler's genealogies of Israel, both in passages unparalleled in other biblical sources, and each very different from the other. The first of these is in the genealogy of Hezron, son of Peretz, son of Judah, the clan which produced the Davidic line. In 1 Chronicles 2:21 and 23, we are told, "Afterward Hezron came to the daughter of Machir, father of Gilead, and he took her. And he was 60 years old, and she bore him Segub, and Segub begat Yair, and he had 23 towns in the land of Gilead. And Geshur and Aram took Havot Yair from them, Kenath and its villages, 60 towns. All these were the sons of Machir, father of Gilead." Since we do not have the time to engage in all of the problems inherent in this pericope, I'll summarize by saying that the passage envisions a connection between the Judite clan of Hezron, which is usually seen as being settled in the area of Bethlehem in Judah, and the clan of Machir in Gilead, which is elsewhere seen as being part of eastern Manasseh, which borders on Aramean territory. Much has been written on the possible historical background of this Hezronite settlement in Gilead, but what is important to us is that the chronicler mentions it, and that he envisions it being ended by a conquest by Geshur and Aram. Let's keep this in mind. 1 Chronicles 7:14-17 gives us a different look at the genealogy of Manasseh. The sons of Manasseh, Asriel, whom his Aramean concubine bore, she bore Machir, the father of Gilead. And Machir took a wife for Shupim and Chupim, and the name of his sister was Ma'acha, and the name of the second was Tzilofchad, and Tzilofchad had daughters. And Ma'acha, the wife of Machir, bore a son, who she named Peresh, and the name of his brother was Sheresh. And his sons were Ulam and Rechem, and the sons of Ulam Bedan. These were the sons of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh. Once again, we do not have the time for a full analysis of this passage. But here, the Manassite Machir was the son of an Aramean concubine, and had a sister and a wife called Ma'acha. No conquest is mentioned here, not by Arameans or by anyone else. We should also keep in mind that in other biblical passages, such as in Deuteronomy 3:14, Ma'acha and Geshur are often presented as being kingdoms, apparently what today we would call the Golan Heights. The next mentions of Aram are in 1 Chronicles 18 and 19, which tell of David's conquests. These chapters parallel 2 Samuel 8 and 10, with quite a few interesting changes. In verse 3, David smites Hadadezer of Tzoba on his way to set his hand on the river Euphrates. Interestingly enough, while in the book of Samuel, Tzoba is often mentioned as being an Aramean kingdom, the chronicler obfuscates this reference so that at least to him, Tzoba is not necessarily part of Aram. In verses 5 and 6, Aram Damascus comes to help Hadadezer and is in turn conquered by David. Here, 4 notes are in order. The first is that in all of the 6 references to Damascus in Chronicles, and only there in the Bible, the name is always spelled Darmesek, a pronunciation that is known in several later Aramaic dialects. The second is that in all of those 6 references, Damascus always appears with reference to Aram. In other words, Damascus is Aram. Third is that in this case, in both Samuel and Chronicles, no king of Damascus is mentioned. And fourth, again in both Samuel and Chronicles, once David places his governors in Damascus, Aram, not just Damascus, are said to become tribute-bearing servants of David. So to the chronicler, Tzoba is not Aram, Damascus is Aram, and Aram is Damascus. Chapter 19, parallel to 2 Samuel 10, tells of David's war with the Ammonites and their allies, but there are quite a few differences between the 2 versions of the story. Samuel's verse 6 lists the allies as the Ammonites sent and hired Aram Bet Rechov and Aram Tzoba 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacha 1,000 men, and the men of Tov 12,000 men. In the chronicler's version, this becomes Hanun and the Ammonites sent 1,000 talents of silver to hire chariots and cavalry from Aram Naharaim, from Aram Maacha, and from Tzoba. So in this passage in Chronicles, Maacha is Aram, Tzoba is not Aram, Aram Beit Rechov and the men of Tov disappear, and we're suddenly faced with a Aram Naharaim, which in Chronicles appears only here. The chronicler may have taken this reference to Aram Naharaim from the superscription of Psalm 60, a michtam of David for teaching when he ignited Aram Naharaim and Aram Tzoba. Our next Aramean encounter is in 2 Chronicles 16, 1-6, which is closely based on 1 Kings 15, 17-22. The story here is well known. Baasha, king of Israel, attacks Asa, king of Judah. Asa turns to Ben-Hadad of Damascus, sending him gold and silver, and Ben-Hadad attacks Israel's northern border, forcing Baasha to retreat from his holdings in Judah. We will not discuss the many historical and archaeological questions that have been raised about this passage, but only the differences in the geographical terms used by the 2 versions. The first such is in the name of the Aramean king, which Kings gives as Ben-Hadad, son of Tavrimon, son of Chetzion of Aram, who resided in Damascus, and Chronicles just abbreviates to Ben-Hadad of Aram, who resided in Damascus. We've already commented on the form Damascus. The chronicler's cutting out Ben-Hadad's pedigree is typical and basically indicates that he did not believe it was important. What is important is Ben-Hadad's designation in both books as king of Aram, rather than more specifically king of Aram Damascus. To our author, the king of Damascus was the king of Aram. Also interesting is what the chronicler does with the names of the towns conquered by Ben-Hadad. According to Kings, these towns are Ion, Dan, Abel Bet Maacha, all of Kinneroth with all the land of Naphtali. The chronicler replaced Abel Bet Maacha with Avel Maim. This city, which is south of Ion and west of Dan, and now being seriously excavated for the first time, seems to preserve some memory of the Aramean entity of Macha, but the actual connection is purely a matter of conjecture. The name in the Chronicles version, Avel Maim, could be a scribal error, or it could simply be the chronicler's way of fixing what to him seemed like a strange connection between a northern Israelite town and an Aramean kingdom. As has often been pointed out, Maim, water, is an appropriate addition to Avel, which means watercourse or stream, together making stream of water. According to 2 Kings 12, 18, 19, Hazael, king of Aram, went up, fought against Gath and captured it, and then Hazael set his face up to go up against Jerusalem. And Joash, king of Judah, took all the votive kings that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, the kings of Judah, had dedicated, as well as his own votive gifts, and all the gold that was found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and sent them to Hazael, king of Aram, and he withdrew from Jerusalem. The Chronicles version in 2 Chronicles 24 is different. It was at the turn of the year that the army of Aram came up against him, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem, and destroyed all of the officials of the people from the people, and all of their plunder they sent to the king of Damascus. For the army of Aram had come with few men, and the Lord delivered into their hand a very great army, because they had abandoned the Lord God of their fathers. And they executed judgments on Joash. And when they went from him, they left him with many wounds, and his servants conspired against him because of the blood of the sons of Jehoiada the priest, and they killed him on his bed, and he died. So this version also tells about an Aramean attack on Jerusalem, but without the preliminary attack on Gath, and without mention of Hazael in person or any other Aramean king by name, just the army of Aram. The outcome was also very different. Instead of Joash paying his tribute and Hazael retreating, here the small Aramean force entered Jerusalem, killed many Judite officials, and sent their plunder to the king of Damascus, and then executed judgments on Joash, leaving him mortally wounded to later be assassinated. According to 2 Kings 16, Ahaz was one of the most evil kings of Judah ever. He was attacked by Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, king of Israel. Ahaz then turned to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, who conquered Damascus, exiled its inhabitants, and abolished the Aramean kingdom. Ahaz then went to Damascus to pay homage to Tiglath-Pileser, and while there made a copy of the idolatrous altar of Damascus and used it to worship in Jerusalem. The chronicler tells quite a different story. In his chapter 28, the kings of Aram and Israel, joined by Edomites and Philistines, each take large numbers of captives from Judah. Ahaz's tribute to Tiglath-Pileser is of no avail, and he too attacks Judah. In fact, not only is the Assyrian conquest of Aram not mentioned, but Ahaz's turning to worship the gods of Damascus is explained in verse 23, and he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus who had defeated him, and said, because the gods of the kings of Aram, they helped them, to them I will sacrifice, and they will help me. And they were the downfall of him and all Israel. So in this version, the Arameans and their gods come out on top. This is actually the very last reference to Aram or Arameans in the entire book of Chronicles. In other words, had we had only the chronicler's version, we would never have heard of the destruction and exile of Aram by the Assyrians. These events were simply not relevant to the chronicler's narrative and the history of Judah. So how does the chronicler picture the Arameans? We can make the following points. As in Genesis, Aram is one of the major components of the Semitic world. This matches a reality of the chronicler's day, in which Arameans are dispersed all over the entire region, and their language and script have become the international lingua franca. Unlike in Genesis, there is no direct ancestral relationship between Israel and Aram. Israel's ancestors were not wandering Arameans, Israel's patriarchs did not marry only Aramean wives, and no pact was concluded between Jacob and Laban on Mount Gilead. If Aramean women did enter the nation, it was as concubines, and if Arameans did come to possess Gilead, it was by conquest. The chronicler's definition of Aram as a polity seems rather limited. Aram is Damascus, and Damascus is Aram. Tsoba, Hamath, and Geshur are not Aram, although perhaps Maachah is as well. This Aram Damascus was conquered by David, but later became an adversary of Israel that was constantly successful, as a tool by which God punished Israel and its kings for their wrongdoing. In the Chronicles' Second Temple period world, there was no such nation as Aram, but Arameans, that is, speakers of Aramaic, were everywhere. So, the ancestor of Aram was near the top of the genealogy of humanity. But in the chronicler's picture of the past, there had been a kingdom of Aram, a fierce enemy of Israel. Geographically, this Aram was limited to the region of Damascus, the chronicler's contemporary Damascus. In the chronicler's world, Aram and Israel do not share a common legacy. Aram had been a hostile kingdom beyond the borders of Israel, a faraway tool with which God could punish Israel if he so wished. Thank you very much.